Well, welcome everyone. I'm Chris Cervanek, the Associate Director at the Center for Civil and Human Rights, and I thank each and every one of you for taking the time to come and join us this evening for this presentation by our guest, Tim Phillips, entitled Beyond Conflict, the Power of Shared Experience. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, the Kellogg Institute, the Kroc Institute, and the Nanovic Institute. And it's my pleasure today to introduce Tim Phillips as a much admired friend and a pioneer in the field of conflict resolution and reconciliation. In 1992, Tim founded Beyond Conflict, which is a global nonprofit initiative. And using the unique approach of shared experience, Beyond Conflict is internationally recognized for contributions to peace and reconciliation in a number of countries, including Northern Ireland, El Salvador, and South Africa. Tim's work with Beyond Conflict was featured in the PBS documentary, The Visionaries, and profiled in the New York Times Sunday magazine. He's advised the UN, the State Department, and the Council of Europe on democracy and conflict resolution initiatives. Tim also helped launch and serves on the advisory committee of the Club of Madrid, a forum for former democratic heads of state and government. Beyond Conflict's 2 decades of work is beautifully described in a new book, Beyond Conflict, 20 Years of Putting Experience to Work for Peace. It tells the compelling stories of 6 leaders from around the world who speak to the power of shared human experience and the human capacity to confront fear. I encourage you to spend some time with this book after Tim's talk and with all the inspiration it provides, and the book will be available for purchase outside at the reception following this talk. It's now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Tim Phillips.
Thank you, Chris. Is this working? And can you hear? Oh. Well, I want to first thank Chris and Steve, 2 very dear friends. I think we're at the age now where I can say old friends. I think I've known Chris Steve, close to 25 years, and not too long after Chris. And it's a real honor and pleasure for me to be here at Notre Dame. Historically, I guess you have a lot more snow where I come from, Boston. But if you've been reading the weather reports, we have 72 inches on the ground. So I'm really thrilled to be here in this cold, sort of tropical environment. So it's also a pleasure for me to be at Notre Dame. I felt a little modest when I read about pioneer and conflict resolution. I mean, this university and the programs that Notre Dame has built and Reverend Hesberg have really pioneered thinking about conflict and reconciliation and human rights around the world. So coming here really resonates for me. And I know a lot of you are from around the world and come from countries where you work on not only conflict but reconciliation and how do you really build vibrant societies that protect our identities. So let me go a little bit into the work we do, and then a bit about this book, and then a little bit about some of the work we're currently doing. So hopefully this will work. Yes. Okay, so founded in 1992. We've done 75 initiatives in over 25 countries around the world. And as you can see, includes the Middle East, Latin America, the Balkans, Eastern Europe, all the way down to Northern Ireland. And, before I get to that, does this go back? Yes. Why did we start? So in 1991, I had the pleasure of being a fellow at something called the Salzburg Seminar, which is an American NGO that has no brand recognition, but it's sort of like a mini Aspen Institute. And every year they bring together what they call emerging leaders from around the world to come together to look at challenges. And I had the pleasure of being invited for a 2-week session with a lot of former dissidents from Central and Eastern Europe who are now running parliaments, ministries of the environment, or new sort of emerged civil society organizations that were looking at dealing with the legacy of environmental damage in Eastern Europe. And if you remember, in 1992 was the Rio Summit on global development in the environment. So this session was to look at how do you prepare for the Rio Summit and how do you really bring together this community of people from these former communist states to deal with this legacy. Because the other issue I've always been deeply concerned about is climate change in the environment. So that 2-week session led to this because I met all these former dissidents. So this is 1991, anywhere from 2 about 2 years after the collapse of the Cold War. And what was really interesting in these sessions, coffee sessions, I should say, beer drinking sessions, long walks into Salzburg, is I would say, how are you dealing with the legacy of your past? How are you dealing with the legacy of collaborators, human rights violations? What are you doing with all these state security files that start to percolate? And they said, that is an issue nobody's really addressing. They said, we're still caught up in the euphoria of the collapse of communism, the building of new market economies, the writing of constitutions, and there are a lot of good self-described experts flying in. But very few people are really asking us, how do we deal with this issue? And it needs to be addressed. And I often joke, being the youngest child of 6, I grew up in a Catholic family, I thought, I have a problem with authority. And I thought, why don't you guys, instead of bringing all these self-described experts in, why don't you bring people who themselves had led transitions from dictatorship to democracy and have them share their experience with these new leaders in post-communist Europe? And in 1991, you had far fewer examples than we have today. You had the southern cone of South America, you had Spain after Franco, denazification in Germany, Greece, and a few other examples. So I was able to connect with a couple of people, one of them being George Soros. I said, what I'd like to do is go back to Salzburg and bring together a lot of these new leaders with people from these countries and from the human rights community to say, how did you deal with this transition? And it was interesting, the first response I got, George Soros and a mutual friend of ours, Wendy Lors, responded right away. He said, that's a great idea. But a lot of the funders said to me, well, these issues make sense, but every situation is unique. We don't understand how people in Eastern Europe can learn from people from Argentina or Chile or Spain. Now, I'm sure there are a couple of people here from maybe either Argentina or Chile. And I thought, well, you don't know many Chileans or Argentines, because they'd be insulted that you said that. I said, but people don't respond to the legacy of repression, violence, and trauma with their national identity card. They respond as humans. Of course, every country will have its own unique experience. But people respond to trauma, to the loss of agency. These are human experiences. And there's real value in looking at this from that perspective, from the legal, from the ethical, moral, and also the practical. What do they do with their state security files? What do they do in Uruguay? What do they do in Argentina and Chile when they were confronted with, do we prosecute the military? So we were able to get this funding. We did this conference in 1992. We had everybody from Václav Havel to Jürgen Habermas to President Alfonsín to Telford Tierlin, the chief prosecutor at Nuremberg. And what I thought would be a one-off conference became a second and third. And then it was sort of, the beginning of this whole sort of transition period where there was funding available and there was support. And we ended up setting up what was then called the Project on Justice in Times of Transition, which we now call Beyond Conflict. And what we developed from the very beginning, which I'll get on to, is this notion of shared experience. So what do we do? And then I'll mention that. We work with leaders in divided societies, struggling with conflict, struggling with change, either in the transition, as we started in the beginning, from dictatorship to democracy, or from conflict to peace. And if you look at anywhere on the sort of spectrum of change, before a peace agreement or peace process begins, in the midst of one, in the aftermath of a peace agreement, in the aftermath of a collapse of a dictatorship, or it could be as the work we're doing now in the Gulf in Bahrain, in the midst of a conflict, trying to get all sides into a dialogue. But we work in this sort of spectrum of change. And what we do is we find the relevant experiences around the world to bring in, to share with leaders at all levels. And we sort of describe leaders as not just sort of political elites, but civil society, grassroots, anybody that exercises leadership in a society, we engage with. But what we bring in is this idea of shared experience. Those who have been through this problem or this particular process before. And through this process, we develop what we call the shared human experience methodology. Now, this isn't something either patented or rocket science. It's pretty basic, pretty intuitive, but it's this notion that people can learn from the experience of others. And by the way, today, funders don't challenge this. More often, and this won't surprise anybody in this room, the biggest hesitation is people who live under conflict or have lived under repression. Why? Because they think their situation is unique. They think nobody will understand what we've suffered and gone through. That's what humans do when they're under these experiences. They feel, I don't want to say become narcissistic, but become very self-centered in our loss and suffering. And it's often when they hear from people who have been in similar situations, or in some cases worse situations, and that have come through the other side, that it really connects with their experience. And I say often that our approach is grounded in three basic principles. People can learn from the experience of others. People can change, and seeing that others have changed is empowering. I'll give you two examples. So in 1994, we organized a conference in Belfast. It's the first time in Northern Ireland's history that all the key players in the conflict came together and sat in the same location under the same roof for 3 days. So we had everybody from Jerry Adams and Mark McGuinness to Ian Paisley and David Trimble and John Hume, the Protestant paramilitaries, the British and Irish governments, and about 300 people from across the community, including victims groups, victims of IRA, kneecapping and violence, and also on the other side. Now, I often say what brought people into the room was not the charm of this small organization in the United States, it's who we brought to the table. So we brought from South Africa, Rolf Meyer and Cyril Ramaphosa. So Rolf was the gentleman who convinced, I'll talk about him in a moment, F.W. de Klerk to release Nelson Mandela from prison. Rolf would have been the next president of South Africa if apartheid had stayed on. And then he led the negotiations to end apartheid. Cyril was the Secretary General of the ANC. He was the chief negotiator for the ANC in the talks. And then we had from El Salvador, Joaquin Villalobos, who is one of the top leaders of the FMLN, President Cristiani. We brought from Colombia, Antonio Navarro Wolf, former M19 guerrilla leader, and then a mayor of one of the Colombian cities. And from Poland, from Eastern Europe, from the Middle East, and maybe 12 different countries around the world. People who had led, and often former enemies, such transitions. And after hearing the two South Africans speak, Jerry Adams came up to me afterwards and said, to think that 2 years ago, we could have imagined that apartheid would have ended peacefully was unbelievable. And here are the two principal people who negotiated, sitting there as friends, not just as former enemies who had worked together, but friends to share their experience is very empowering. And it really resonates what they said with our own experience. And we ended up doing about 20 initiatives over the following decade, both in Northern Ireland and bringing Northern Ireland leaders out, including in 1996 and 97, the one in 96 at George Mitchell's request. We brought all the leaders who were involved in the Good Friday negotiations to South Africa, where they met with Mandela, they met with de Klerk and many others, to help them think through what change looks like. And that compromise is not as bad as they thought. So here's a couple of photos. It's nothing like a nice photo. So the gentleman on the right is Rolf Meyer. The gentleman on the left you may recognize as Jerry Adams, and that's at the conference in 1994. This was in Nicaragua in 1994. The gentleman on the right who passed away last year is General Jaruzelski, if you may remember, was the last communist dictator of Poland. And the gentleman on the left, this is actually a photo I took, is Adam Michnik, who was the intellectual father of Solidarity. Now the irony is, these two are, look at them, and look at the face of Adam Michnik. He's alive, he's animated, he's like, wow, we're talking to this guy. Now the backstory is, when he was, took control as a general, head of the army, seized control, the political control of Poland in the, must have been in the late 60s, early 70s. He kept on getting reports as Solidarity was emerging that while Lech Walesa was the sort of the guy at the Gdansk shipyard, and he could connect with the workers, but the mastermind was some guy named Adam Michnik. And Jaruzelski, being a good general, would say to his lieutenants, all right, at this stage they were no longer killing people, but they would put them in prison, they'd exile them, or in this case, they'd draft them into the military and shut them up. So he said, I want this guy, Michnik, drafted. 2 months later, he reads another press report that Michnik is creating troubles in different cities of Poland. And he says, I thought this guy was going to be drafted. They said, well, we tried, but the problem is he stutters. And he said, wait a minute, the guy that's leading this movement stutters? And so there was all this interesting sort of backstory of their history together. And so in 1994, we ended up bringing Jaruzelski and Adamishnik and a couple other Poles to Nicaragua with leaders from several other countries. And the reason being is in 1989, when the Sandinistas lost the election, they didn't expect to lose an election. And so there was no negotiated transition in Nicaragua. And so there was no thinking about not just the negotiations of power and institutional change, but about reconciliation. And so, again, when we think about shared experience, we say, who would resonate with the Nicaraguans? Who would resonate with the Sandinista leadership? Who would resonate with the former Contra community or other Nicaraguans? And so we had everybody from Jimmy Carter and Alfonsine came, but particularly these two. And when you bring people like this to a country, as we brought the people from South Africa and elsewhere to Belfast, it creates curiosity. People want to meet these people. And then once they're there, people start listening. And they start recognizing, wow, there are a lot of similarities. You know, somebody said, you know, in Spanish, we don't have a word for compromise that as you use it in the United States. And Michnik and Jaruzelski said, well, we have no word for that in Polish, the way you understand it. And so rather than the differences being very, you know, clear to people, the similarities started emerging. No, we don't have a tradition of that. How did you handle that? How did you deal with it? Now, I often say to people, the gentleman in the far right is not from the Harry Potter movie. He was the head of the ELN guerrilla movement, Francisco Galan. And the three gentlemen to the left are all from Northern Ireland. The gentleman, I guess, to the far left, next to Galan, Tom Roberts, was a loyalist paramilitary leader, spent a decade in prison for terrorism, for bombing. Next to him, David Irvine, who unfortunately passed away about 5 years ago, was also a loyalist paramilitary leader, who said that he joined the UVF paramilitaries in the early 1970s when he was 17 years old, when an IRA bomb killed somebody with the same age, same name, but no relation. And he was so traumatized by that experience, he said the only good defense is good offense. So he joined the UVF, was responsible for several assassinations and terrorist activities. And he said when he was in prison, he and his other loyalist paramilitaries learned Irish so they could understand what the IRA prisoners were saying. And he said, I came to realize that we had more in common with them than often many of the people in our own community. You know, we were equally excluded. We were equally marginalized. And what are we doing killing each other and fighting each other? And he said, you know, I realized that we had, you know, justified violence, that we had killed to live, and then we end up living to kill. And that unless you're a sociopath, this is often his words, you know, it's not easy to resort to violence. Whole communities of people don't resort to violence easily unless they feel a deep sense of grievance and a narrative develops in their community to justify that. How do you change that? How do you create a new social norm for your community that moves away from the justification of violence to something more powerful? And he became one of the real leaders in doing that. And the gentleman to his, I guess, left, Father Alec Reed, Catholic priest, who unfortunately also passed away a few years ago. And Jerry Adams and Mark McGuinness today say the person who was most responsible for the IRA entering into a peace process was that man. Because he happened to be a parish priest along the Falls Road, which was a heavily IRA Sinn Féin community. And he said, and Alec told me this story a few years ago, he said these IRA combatants, in the privacy of the confessional, would come in and say, we can't handle this anymore. We can't handle the pressure, the stress, the killing, the threats to our lives, to our families. But we can't say that to our community. You know, we just can't go out there and do that. And he said, the thing is, I recognize that some of them would commit suicide, not by committing suicide the way you would sort of conventionally think about it, but by carrying out an act of violence, blowing up a building, because they wanted to kill themselves, but thought in the process of doing that, they would bring glory to their name and to their family. And he said, this just has to end. And so he ended up putting his life at risk, played a key role in the early days of brokering talks between John Hume and the SDLP, which is a Catholic political movement or party, and then the Irish Republicans. Why did we bring them to Colombia in 1996 and 2006 and 7? Because then President Uribe and other people in the government said, listen, this is before FARC negotiations. The ELN was prepared to consider a peace process and negotiations. This gentleman was under house arrest, Francisco Galan, in this sort of halfway house. And he wanted to convince his colleagues in the ELN leadership that they could move into a peace process, that it's not total loss. And we brought in these three individuals, and they so resonated with Francisco Galan that we ended up having 3 meetings, including 2 of them going to Havana to meet with the ELN leadership. Because they were able to say to Galan, listen, we know what it's like to have to transition from violence to politics. We know who the spoilers are. We know the fault lines that emerge. We know what it's like to do this in a way that maintains not only your credibility, but your authority in your own community. And it's very powerful. So, as we were entering our 21st anniversary, we not only changed our name to Beyond Conflict, did some other branding things. We also realized that we should do a book, because as an American NGO, we were very clear. You know, people often say, what's your real agenda? What are you doing in our country? What is it you're trying to achieve? You're doing this because you want to raise money for your organization, get more publicity. So we always kept ourselves a bit, I would say, under the radar screen, but we didn't seek a lot of publicity. But we came to realize that we had accomplished a lot in 20 years. We no longer worked in those countries. And it was important to be able to tell, you know, whether it be people studying or people working in countries, who we are and what we've done. So we decided to do this book with the goal that this book, I mean, as you know, with books, you can give them away for free and there's no guarantee somebody will pick it up. But the notion was, if we could write a book that both talked about our shared experience approach, that would resonate today and 30 years from now, whether it be in South Bend, Indiana, or in Boston, or Gaza, or Belfast, we picked 6 themes and 6 leaders we worked with. And we wanted to tell their story in a way that would resonate with different audiences. So the first one is Confronting Dictatorship. And this gentleman, Jan Urban, with Václav Havel, was one of the key founders of the Czech dissident movement. His parents were partisans against the Germans in World War II. They were real heroes. They were early founders of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. But they started to see by the early to mid-60s that the system was corrupt. But because of their status from World War II, they couldn't be thrown in prison. So what did the leadership do? They sent him as ambassador to Norway. And Jan, as a young teenager, was all of a sudden in the West. And he realized these people are human. They don't have horns. And I think, as he often jokes, by temperament, he was a person that also had a problem with authority, particularly living under communism. He came back and became one of the leading dissidents. And what this chapter does is not talk from a historical point of view about repression, but what it did to him, what it did to his family, his community, and his nation. And one of the most powerful things he said is how it makes you become a victim. He said, when you spend your life as a victim, there's no responsibility attached. All of your life is decided outside of you, and whatever you do is right simply because you are a victim and you suffer. There's no agency. It's not your fault. And he said, I would look around under communism and I'd see everybody hold their head down. But he said a year, 2 years, 3 years after communism ended, people are still doing that. He said, how do you change that? He said, that's what repression does. Whether it's dictatorship, communist dictatorship in Poland, or living in a conflict, or let's be honest, living in families anywhere in this country. It's the human experience. You know, people lose agency, and they become a victim, and they become very self-centered. Why? Because that's a survival response. So he talks about, in this chapter, what it did to him and his community. Rolf Meyer, who I mentioned earlier. So I showed you the photo with Jerry Adams. This is the same year, or a year earlier. Rolf is standing behind Nelson Mandela, And then there's de Klerk and a gentleman named Buthelezi, who's then the head of Inkatha, the Zulu. So I mentioned, not only was Rolf, he was Minister of Defense, he had been Minister of Police. He describes that he went through this paradigm shift, and that de Klerk went through a pragmatic shift. He said a paradigm shift is when you're physiologically, emotionally realize that you have to change, that the system that you embrace, support, and defend is morally corrupt. Whereas he said de Klerk never really felt that. He realized, though, the political dynamics were changing, and therefore he had to go along with that change. And it was a pragmatic shift. What was interesting, about a year ago, 2 years ago, there was an interview with de Klerk by a CNN correspondent in Pretoria. And the correspondent asked de Klerk what he thought all these years later about the end of apartheid. And he said, it wasn't that bad. And Rolf called me up and said, see, that's the difference between a pragmatic shift and a paradigm shift. But I want to tell you a quick, amazing story about Rolf, because in this chapter, it's how do you recognize the need to change? Again, this is universal, right? You don't have to live in a country suffering through conflict or repression. It's, again, the human experience. How do you recognize the need for change? His story is multifaceted, but he tells one very powerful story, that when he was Minister of the Interior, he was interviewing a young ANC combatant. And he asked the combatant, he said, why did you join the guerrilla movement? He said, when I was 6 or 7, my parents worked for an Afrikaner farmer out in the valley. And one day, I was in the back of the farmer's pickup truck with the farmer's dog. And it started to rain heavily. And the farmer pulled over, got out, took the dog, left me in the back of the truck, and put the dog in the front seat and drove on. And Rolf just stood there. He said, it just shocked my core. He said, who does that to a young child? I mean, it's not like this farmer didn't have empathy, but he had it for his dog, and not for a young child. He said, what is it about our system that it dehumanized a young child like that? And he said, that for him was that crystal moment we realized the system I'm defending has to end. And he was being prepared to be the next president. So we all know that we look at leaders around the world and say, how do we get them to think more of our country than their own personal power? And here's Rolf. Apartheid didn't necessarily have to end when it did if it wasn't for someone like Rolf and a few others that pushed the system and pushed the leadership to make it happen. So he talks about what it is to recognize the need for change. And one of the things he often does when he goes around the world, he says, don't look for a Mandela. That's an excuse. Do what's required yourself. So Jose Maria Argueta from Guatemala, a wonderful friend. I have to say, I'm honored that all of them are, but Jose Maria, his chapter is changing mindsets. How in a deeply divided society, in his case Guatemala, do you change mindsets? And he has this wonderful approach that he developed, which I won't spend a lot of time talking about, but he now calls it enlightened dissent. And the key thing about it is he said, in a deeply divided society, it's a big mistake. And not just in the divided society, he thinks more generally. You don't go to people who don't trust each other and say, we're going to work to reach consensus, or promote agreement, or reconciliation. Because what do? They pull back. They defend their position. They don't listen to understand, they listen to defend. So he said, in Guatemala, what I realized is we first had to prepare people to think in terms of their own interest. And what he created with another colleague was this incredible program, which I don't think gets enough attention, which, as I said, he now calls enlightened dissent, where essentially he brings together, or them, for 9 months, in a setting like this, emerging leaders from maybe 24 different sort of groups of the society. So in Guatemala, it was mine leaders, labor leaders, military, police, the economic elite, you name it. He would bring them together for 3 nights a week for 9 months. And what he would do is he'd teach all of them. They'd create this curriculum for the first month, strategic analysis skills, very neutral. And they would apply that to everything they talked about. But once they understood strategic analysis, they would start off talking about global issues. So today, if it was running, they talk about what's happening right now in Europe with Ukraine, Russia, and NATO, and the US. What may be happening with Greece and Germany. So they talk about all of these safe, distant issues. in which these Guatemalans, and then he later took it to Salvadorans, wouldn't feel a personal connection or threat to. And they'd talk about these, and they'd apply the strategic filter. Why did they do this? Well, why didn't Germany respond this way? Why is Greece doing that? But he said what would happen is, over the months, we would go from talking about global issues to sort of Latin American issues, and then we'd get to Central American issues. And by the time we got to the Guatemalan and Salvadoran issues, they could listen rather than listen to defend, listen to understand. They weren't afraid to compromise. They weren't putting people in boxes or categories. They got to know each other. And he said by starting off where they weren't able to defend themselves, they developed, literally he would joke, a rewired brain. And by the way, I'll mention, there's now evidence, we have this initiative I'll mention with MIT on neuroscience and social conflict. Not only do we know empirically that change can happen, there's now biological evidence. The brain is plastic. It does change. And what some of these neuroscientists who have met with him said, we're pretty certain that what happened over those 9 months is that we rewired certain neural structures of their brain so that they could actually behave differently and act differently. By the way, this photo was taken in Lima. So if you remember in 1997, the Tupac Amaru guerrillas took the Japanese embassy hostage with all these diplomats and senior government officials. And he was one of the ambassadors there. He was the Guatemalan ambassador. And he became the key negotiator with the leadership of the Tupac Amaru. And they released him so that he could cut a deal. And then President Fujimori, I think it was Montesinos, the Minister of the Interior, were not going to do that. And they had him sent back to Guatemala. And then 2 months later, they stormed the embassy and killed all the Tupac Amaru, and some other people were killed. And the Japanese foreign minister was so deeply impressed by the role he was playing that they asked him to be the ambassador to Japan, and he later went there for 3 years. Another chapter, this woman, Monica McWilliams from Belfast, is about how do you build trust among enemies. And she was, again, a very powerful person. Women in Northern Ireland then and today were not seen as equal partners. So she and some other women created this movement called the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, ran, got elected, and got seats and were negotiators in the Good Friday talks. And she talks about what is it to build trust with people who you don't even know. I mean, literally, Northern Ireland is 1.2 million people. People don't know each other. And how do you build trust across those divides? Close. So, I didn't want to give you all of the chapters, because I hope you would find the occasion to buy the book. But I will say 2 things to wrap up, and then we can go to questions. So what else are we working on? Well, we have our sort of country and regional programs, and these chapters grew out of that experience. And we don't do one-off programs. In Northern Ireland, we did about 20 initiatives. We've been working now the last 3.5 years in Bahrain. We've done nearly 20 initiatives. We did a lot of work in the Balkans. We've spent the last 4 years working on Cuba. And I will say, because we're at Notre Dame, that we got the Pope involved in the Cuba breakthrough. And I often say, as not always the most devout Catholic myself, you know, getting access to the Cardinal in Boston to the Vatican was one of those serendipitous, wonderful moments. And the Pope, you know, as we see, is a deeply committed person and played a huge role in the breakthrough of Cuba. So I mentioned neuroscience and social conflict. Why do we do this? Because we realize, I often say that the DNA of our organization is this recognition of shared human experience. Now, that doesn't say that every situation is analogous and alike. But again, people respond as humans. Culture, ethnicity, race, ideology, all sit on an operating system called the human brain. And the Polish brain is not different from the Salvadoran brain or the American brain. And so we've been finding, working with incredible scientists, and not just neuroscientists, various behavioral scientists, even political scientists and others who are working in this community, some amazing insights about what drives our behavior. And I have 2 or 3 here just to point out. 1, social rejection, humiliation, discrimination is experienced in the brain as physical pain. And not only is it experienced as physical pain, it happens in the region of the brain called the limbic system, which is the emotional region of the brain. And cognition, or to think rationally, requires that not only you feel safe, but that you feel that you're being understood in that moment. And there's so many ways you can think of what discrimination does, but to know that it's experienced as physical pain, I think, is a very powerful insight. Exclusion. It impairs cognitive function. That's well demonstrated in the behavioral sciences. Sacred values. Now, that's a very intuitive topic. A parent to protect their child, a deeply religious person about the principles of their religion. For a lot of Americans, the Second Amendment is a deeply felt sacred value. Now, what's interesting is it turns out neuroimaging is confirming that we experience sacred values in a different region of the brain than all other calculations we make. And that when you approach somebody who holds a sacred value, to try to bribe them, give them an economic payoff, to regulate, they hold on more deeply to their sacred value, they respond aggressively. And it gets more and more difficult to get to a point of common ground. All you have to do is look at the Second Amendment debate in this country. It's kind of outrageous. But why? Why is this important? Because when you recognize how we process sacred values, nobody is really recognizing that. Doesn't mean you have to share those sacred values. The research shows that you have to acknowledge sacred values. You have to say to somebody, I understand how sacred this is to you. I understand it. This is your right to have. And what literally happens is they shift from that emotional region of the brain to the cognitive, rational part of the brain, where you then can begin to have a conversation that's built on common ground. Look what's happened recently in Paris, right? The French state, for all their legitimate great reasons, to be secular is sacred to the French. But they don't realize that by violating what is sacred to Muslims, that doesn't protect what is sacred to them. And what David Irvine said many years ago, he said, what I came to realize is that in order for me to protect what is sacred to me, being Protestant and being British, meant that I had to recognize what was sacred to the people around me. Only then, and to respect that, could I protect what was sacred to me. So we feel strongly that just understanding more and more of these insights that we're gaining from the behavioral sciences and apply that to these real-world challenges, I think we'll develop a much better framework and way of addressing what drives human behavior. And an incredible one, we just did a meeting in Washington 2 weeks ago. Focus on norms, not attitudes. All of these scientists say, it doesn't matter what people say, it's what they do. And seeing what others in their group do will have a more, bigger, deeper impact on their behavior than what anybody says. And so to focus on language, to focus on attitudes is less important. Just focus on behavior and the norms that are established by people with influence in that community. And even empathy. We often talk about we have to encourage empathy. But as my colleague Lior often points out, empathy is a two-edged sword. A lot of these suicide bombers turn out to be some of the most empathetic people there is. They do what they do because they empathize with the people in their community. They feel they're going to defend them. So empathy on its own is not a godsend. Empathy can be a very dangerous thing. It's how it's channeled. And so the more we understand what drives our behavior, I think the more it will, frankly, I think, revolutionize how we think about not only conflict and reconciliation or even human rights, but how we think about what it is to be human and what drives our behavior. And one of the things about social norms, for example, if you look in West Africa, a lot of development agencies and governments were giving money to governments to put up these big billboards. Saying, literally there would be these billboards. Thousands of women, young women, children have been raped and tortured. And rather than reducing those incidences, it was increasing it. Because being deeply social animals, the majority of our behavior and thinking is deeply unconscious. And what they point out, the scientists we work with, is that we don't even have conscious access to what drives most of our behavior. And because we are deeply social animals, we pick up unconsciously cues. What is the dominant group doing? And even, I'll give you an example that's less horrific, but of the same theme. recycling towels in hotels. I now collect all these little signs. 90% of them get it wrong. They say, recycle the towel, it's good for the environment. What all the research shows is it should say 90% of the people who stayed in this hotel room have recycled towels. And you know what? Towels, you know what happens? The number skyrockets. So, and even some of the conversations about rape in colleges and campuses, the more we talk about it. So it's like, how do you handle this? But the more, we have to realize how social norms drive our behavior. The more we talk about it, is it contributing to the increase or is it decreasing it? And these are things we really need to understand about what drives human behavior. Because whether we like it or not, we are mammals and we are wired for survival. And most of what we do is driven by the survival instinct, and it's deeply unconscious. So we hope and believe that by gaining these insights, working with these scientists across disciplines, then we can educate, and then we can hopefully translate these findings. And the last thing is revisiting the past and divided society. Truth commissions grew out of Argentina and Chile, and then sort of, I don't want to say perfected, but then sort of brought to South Africa, where the states were the main perpetrators of violence. It's become the international go-to model and norm. But the biggest problem in Northern Ireland, when they talked about a South African-style Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is it created more tension than anything else. Why? Because whose truth is being told? In a place like Northern Ireland, the state wasn't the main perpetrator of violence. It was civilian on civilian. And what's interesting from the insights from neuroscience is we need to be understood. As one scientist said to me, we are not rational beings with emotions. We are emotional beings who can only think rationally when we feel that our identities are understood and valued by others. Now think of that in the context of Northern Ireland. The tens of thousands of Catholics who supported Sinn Féin in the IRA, or the tens of thousands who supported the Loyalist paramilitaries. When people come in and say we're going to establish a truth commission, they go into a defensive position. And they're saying, wait a minute, you're saying that what we did, the people who died, what was sacred to us, protecting our community, was wrong? And so we really need to challenge these things. And so what we want to do with this initiative is to really ask is, what are the appropriate ways you deal with the past in divided societies where the state wasn't the main perpetrator? And with that, what are the lessons learned? I think we all know this. Change is possible. And now there's a biological basis for it, because it's amazing. Biologically, we can change our behavior. Inclusion is the basis of sustainable change. The flip side of that is exclusion is the main driver of conflict, in my view. People need to be acknowledged as they see themselves. And then understanding is more important than trust. And what's interesting, we took a group of Iranian leaders to Belfast 2 years ago. And they asked all from Protestant, Catholic, and other sides. I don't know if there's another side in Northern Ireland, but the Catholic and Protestant sides, and maybe more secular side. And they said, do we need to have trust to negotiate? And they said, not at all. That comes later. But insights from both experience and from science shows that we need to be understood. We need to be heard as we see ourselves. Think of our own families. I can tell you my own family. When my three sisters argue, I don't get involved and say, yes, that's true, she said that, and you're absolutely right. Because it's the filtering of what they believe to be happening that is more important than what actually happened. And the same thing happens in these societies. So that's it. No. So that's my presentation. I think I went over the clock and I really apologize.
That's fine. Let's take questions for about 15 minutes.
Sure.
Hi.
First,
if you
thank
just
you.
wouldn't mind just
Sorry, I'm
hard of hearing.
sitting really low. My name is Michelle. I'm a student in the LLM program in International Human Rights Law. And I was wondering if, with Beyond Conflict, you sometimes address questions of accountability and retributive justice. Because as human rights lawyers, I mean, it's something that we deal more than with reconciliation as peace building, for example. So I just wanted to know if you had something to say about accountability.
Yeah, I mean, in the beginning, when we started our work, that was a major issue. certainly in Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, there's a question of how do we deal with the people who are the collaborators or are committing human rights violations. And one of the things we did in the early 90s, there was this movement towards what they called lustration, purging, which is, by using state security files, which are very dodgy, whether or not these files reflected the truth of what actually happened. We worked through the Council of Europe to come up with a set of principles of, how should you hold these people accountable and what's the basis for it? And if I recall, it was based on, did people commit human rights violations? Not if they were a member of a political party, held a position, because those were some of the criteria that was being developed in Eastern Europe, Central Europe in the early 90s. That just being a member of the Communist Party was a reason to be stripped of your position and to be potentially imprisoned. We played a key role in introducing the Truth Commission in South Africa in the early 90s. We brought a conference with Alex Brain and Desmond Tutu and others in 93, 94, leaders from Eastern Europe and Latin America. And the experience that resonated the most was the Latin American Truth Commission experience, particularly the Chilean. So we had Pepe Zaligat and a couple other people at that conference, and the follow-up conference several months later focused just on truth commissions, and we brought President Aylwin and Pepe Zaligat and others to South Africa. But since a lot of our work tended to be on how do you promote dialogue, how do you get people to talk to each other, as you know, the accountability issues have been complicated. Personally, I often feel I meet a lot of people who should be held accountable, but that's just one piece of this whole project.
Yes, hello, my name is Judy Santarriaga. I'm from Colombia. I'm studying the same.
Would you mind speaking up a little? Sorry.
My name is Judy. I'm from Colombia. I'm studying the LLM in International Human Rights Law, and I have 3 questions. First, I would like to know, thank you for your presentation, because in Colombia, we used to say that our conflict is unique. So thank you for sharing with us this project, and especially when you said that the chapter of Confronting Dictatorships, because the FARC all the time says that we are victims, and I think that they justify their actions in many ways, saying that. But my questions are related with you mentioned that you participated with the ELN, especially with Francisco Galan, and I would like to know if you have some mechanisms to follow up the participation of the ELN in the process for initiating peace talks with the government. First, then I would like to know if how was this process in the reality to have that meeting with Francisco Galan, because I would like to know if in this process the Catholic Church intervened, and also I would like to know if you participated in the decision of the guerrilla, of the FARC, to initiate the peace talks.
Yeah, thank you. No, we didn't get involved with the FARC. We got involved with the ELN through somebody who had been doing, actually from Columbia University, who had been doing research with both sort of right-wing paramilitaries and the ELN, and also the FARC later. And then he came to meet Francisco Galan and realized that this person was serious about peace. But his challenge was, how do I shift a narrative? How do I go from, what justified the ELN's position in violence to one where they can enter into a political process? And he started sharing lessons elsewhere. But there's nothing more powerful than having people who have actually been in his situation come and share that experience. And I don't think he really understood what he was in for until he met these 3. And it was so powerful. And the only way we could meet with him is for the Colombian government to make it available, because he was under house arrest. He was sort of in this halfway house. And we then, not only met with members of the Colombian Senate, but also then President Uribe and then Defense Minister Santos. And they all encouraged us to continue to work with the ELN. And so we had follow-up meetings in Colombia. I think this was in Medellin. And then I think it was called the Casa de la Paz, where this happened. And then we sent some people to Havana. And it played a role. It really helped them sort of shift. And it was because, I often sort of joke, it's like a big support group on wheels, that we bring in people who have been through this. And, they see not only the commonalities, but then they see a resource of sort of these peers that they can ask questions of. So that's what we did, and then it stopped. Because you remember, then there were these fits and starts of processes, and then the FARC negotiations dominant. And now I hear that talks with the ELN have restarted. The one thing is Francisco Galan, we may have been too successful with him, because when he realized that some people in ELN weren't ready to change, he left the movement. So that was one of the reasons we ended up stopping our work about 1.5 years, 2 years later.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Samuel. I'm a JSD student at the Center for Civil and Human Rights. Mine is sort of a comment, actually. On your last slide, you talked about the lesson learned. And I find that very interesting, because especially the two parts include inclusion and understanding, because I know that many of the reasons behind conflicts, not only in Africa, but in most other countries, is a lack of inclusion and understanding between different factions. And I'm just wondering whether you've thought of using this experience to also prevent potential conflicts in countries. Because if you use this same principle of inclusion and understanding, and if you try to create a dialogue in the forum for people from different factions in countries to come together and discuss and then come to a solution, perhaps we could stop most of the potential conflicts that are yet to come, and even maybe stop those that are already ongoing. So I'm just wondering if you have that kind of project in mind. Thank you.
Well, ideally, and thank you. I touched upon it, but I've come to see that exclusion is the main driver of conflict. And I wrote an essay a few months ago that I published in The Guardian called Maliki, Morsi, and Mandela. And this was when Maliki in Iraq stepped down. And if you remember, President Obama was saying that the Shia-led government of Iraq had to build an inclusive government. Because one of the things that really gave ISIS support in Iraq was a Sunni community that felt completely excluded, marginalized, and they would rather join forces with these people than what they were experiencing under Maliki's leadership. And you look at what happened next door with President Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood. So you had the Muslim Brotherhood and you had the Shia community in these two different countries experience exclusion for decades. When they had power, they just continued on that experience of exclusion. They just put it on or visited it upon the people that had excluded them previously. Look at Nelson Mandela when he came out of prison. Now we think of him as this iconic figure, which he is, but when he went into prison, he didn't have this view that I wanted to be an inclusive person. First, he came from a tribal tradition, which by its very definition is exclusive. And then secondly, he was involved in the armed struggle against the Afrikaner government. And his early language was a language of, I wouldn't say violence, but not one of inclusion and the sort of moderation we later saw. When he came out of prison, as somebody said, he decided that he wanted a country and not just power. And the challenge is how do you find and promote leaders where there's no, as I often say, muscle memory of inclusion. You know, people who have power don't want to compromise. And people who haven't had power are afraid to compromise. So there are these dynamics at play, which is how do you start this ahead of time? How do you find and nurture those leaders who recognize that what they're seeking is more to build a country and not just to have power, and not to exercise power the way others had previously. And I think that's one of the central challenges of the work we all do, right? But I think recognizing how deeply destructive exclusion is. And as I mentioned earlier, what's really powerful about these insights in the behavioral sciences, social rejection is exclusion, and we experience it as physical pain. And people who experience that their entire lives are multi-generations in a community. For them to act and think differently is actually kind of an anomaly. And it requires leaders who then create new social norms of behavior. So rather than think you have to change everybody's mindset, you've got to find those leaders who have the authority in a community to say, we're going to act and behave differently.
First, thank you for your presentation. My name is Brenda Tejada. I'm a second year master's student at the Kroc Institute for International Peace. And I'm a Colombian psychologist, so you may know that I'm really happy to see how you're actually just bring or bridge these two disciplines that seem so different, like justice, peace, or public policy, social policy, and psychology. And to make it more interdisciplinary, actually, that's part of my research in how the field of social psychology and behavioral sciences, as you were mentioning, how we can actually enrich the practices of reconciliation or transitional justice mechanisms, how we can actually just bring different knowledge from beyond the judicial or the religious or the political science into actually understanding how we make peace and how we come to terms with the past and how we just, what is justice in terms of expanding also the knowledge of justice is what it means for us as human beings to make justice. So first, that's an acknowledgement, and second, I would like to know how you actually started to think about this. I mean, how do you build a approach and a methodology based on these perspectives, or of mediation built in these perspectives rather than, I don't know, other theories or more like hard sciences?
Well, thank you. So I think our insights that are reflected in this book and the work we've done has been based on experience, right? So we started with this notion of people can learn from the experience of others, and then 20 odd years of doing that work found it to be rather true. And we gained a lot of insights. But what we're doing now with our neuroscience and social conflict initiative, and really should be called behavioral sciences and social conflict, it's to bring together scientists. So we bring together neuroscientists, evolutionary biologists, anthropologists, social psychologists, believe it or not, political scientists now, practitioners and leaders, under three sort of main approaches. Education, how do you educate audiences about what we already know about the human brain and what research is underway. Secondly, research, bringing together these communities to do research, to say, okay, what do you know so far and what else can we do work on? So for example, the folks we're working with are doing leading work on empathy, fear extinction. Believe it or not, one of the most universal experiences of life is humiliation, and there's only one study that looks at how we process humiliation in the brain. We're doing work on dehumanization, social norms. When I say we, it's not like we have a lab at Beyond Conflict, but we work with these labs and partners around the world. And then translation. How do we translate these findings into practice? And we did our first meeting 3 years ago at the MIT Media Lab, which I call sort of Brain 101, and we had an incredible group of people there. What brought to that was a second meeting a year later on dehumanization. The most recent one we did a year ago was on norms, narratives, and neurons. And the one we have coming up, which is tied to our Roma work, is on prejudice and discrimination. And what's really interesting is, from the dehumanization meeting, came a request from, well, what we brought in, I said, okay, if we're going to talk about dehumanization, let's bring in people that can talk about it with real power. And so we brought in a Roma leader who also runs the Soros Foundation's Roma Initiative. And he said, 8 million Roma in Europe, the most discriminated people on the continent of Europe. And the EU is finishing the decade of Roma inclusion. And the Soros Foundation has spent $7 million and nothing has changed. It's actually getting worse. And a couple of the neuroscientists came to me afterwards and said, well, what if we take what we know from empirically from dealing with discrimination, race relations in the United States, and insights from behavioral sciences, do an analysis, a baseline study of discrimination against the Roma, and see if we can come up with different interventions. And so we're in that process now. We got funding. And I'll say two incredible insights that came out of it. One is we're working with, in Budapest, with teachers in training who are going to work with the Roma communities. They're not Roma, but they will work with Roma communities. And the way the scientists measure it is that these teachers view the Roma, even though you would think, okay, they're going to be empathetic to work with the Roma, with disgust. That's how they measure it. They view them not quite as human, right? And here's what's really interesting. We process disgust differently in the brain than we process fear. So when you think of disgust, right, it's like, ugh, you want to stamp it out, you want to get rid of it, right? I don't want that thing on my body. So when you view people, communities with disgust, what does that lead to? It leads to eradication. It leads to a form of dehumanization. It's deeply troubling. Fear is that that person or community is a threat to my survival. So it turns out that non-African Americans view Black Americans with fear, not disgust. So understanding how fear and disgust are processed in the brain is very powerful information in terms of coming up with strategies to deal with these problems. Then there's all this stuff about implicit bias and so forth. But what we're trying to do is bring together these disciplines. Our interest is to translate this into practice. So the first one is this work we're doing on the Roma. And now we've been asked by this mayor of Boston, the head of public safety, saying, are there insights from not only this work but our other work on gang violence, bullying, what's the other one? Reintegration of people in prison. And we've done that around the world, reintegration of former combatants into society. But that's the goal, and to launch this initiative. Thank you. I think we have time for one more.
Sean?
It's your call, Chris.
We have one more,
Okay.
absolutely.
Let's look at the clock.
Sean, political science senior. While not a matter of life and death, our own Congress is by many measures more divided than it has been at any time since Reconstruction, and our electorate isn't much better. So how would you apply this model of shared human experience in a room with America's political leaders?
Great question, and one we've often talked about, right? In our group and elsewhere. Well, let me put it this way. I've been approached by a number of leaders we've worked with around the world who have expressed deep concern about the direction the United States is heading in. And not just our foreign policy, but our political leadership and how it's exercised at home within this country. And the question is how do you convey that to a community that's so deeply divided? And it's an issue we're thinking about. There's no immediate answer. I'm sure there are a lot of insights about this. One thing, again, is more generically social norms, leaders. And there's a phrase called convert communicator, which is who are the people that have the credibility to bring their community along? They have to still have credibility, right? They have to be, if it's a conservative community, it has to be somebody who's still very conservative, hasn't given up those credentials, not seen as selling out. They can move their community in a direction. We've done a lot of work with Cuban Americans over the last 4 years on how they reshape a narrative about Cuba and reconciliation. And there's a Cuban American leader who said two things that are relevant. He said, one, there's an intense competition of victimhood among Cuban Americans. But the other thing is, he said, the more prominent Cuban Americans, like the Fanjuls and others, say, wait a minute, we should talk about change, we should embrace reconciliation, have actually gone to Havana, that this older generation, he told the story of this woman who's in her 90s, one of the wealthiest families in Cuba. This woman has supported all the conservative Cuban American Foundation strategies. She said, I will never step foot in Cuba until everybody's restituted. About 8 months ago, she said to Carlos, you know, I've seen so-and-so talk about reconciliation. I've seen so-and-so go. And she's starting to think, am I missing out on something? Where's my community going? And how do I not lose out in that connection? And that's the power of social norms. But meaning, who are the leaders that have the authority within that community to move people in another direction? So I think just brainstorming is finding those people that can say to both Democrats and Republicans and others, you know, and have credibility in those communities, that we really have to develop a different sort of politics. And I don't see anybody doing that right now.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. Please, let's take more questions and conversation out to the atrium for refreshments, and join me in thank you.